Okay, in this video, I'm going to be talking about consumer interactions, and I'm basically picking up where we left off in class on Thursday. This is the material that we didn't get to, and I wanted to cover this in a video before our next class so that we could just get caught up on everything and start talking about trophic interactions, our new topic on Tuesday. So I think all of this material will be pretty straightforward, but if you have any questions about anything that I talk about, you can always email me before Tuesday or bring your questions to class and I'll give you a chance to ask them at the beginning of class on Tuesday. So let's get started. The learning objective for this video, and this is one that we had on Thursday as well, is just that I want you to be able to describe how different types of species interactions, in this case consumer interactions, influence the abundance distribution and evolution of one or both species. And here's our chart of species interactions again. We've already talked about competition and all the positive interactions on this chart. And so today I'm just going to be talking about the consumption interactions, which includes predation, herbivory, and parasitism. And what's unique about these interactions is that all of them involve one species benefiting by consuming the other interacting species. So the consumer is the beneficiary in the interaction, and the individual that's being consumed is obviously being harmed. So it's benefiting one species, harming the other. And so to start talking about the effects of consumers on distribution and abundance of their hosts or prey, remember that on Thursday we talked about the fact that mutualists have positive effects on the distribution and abundance of their the interacting species, and what we'll see with consumers is that they always have negative effects. So an example of this is the hemlock woolly adelgid, which is not native to the United States. It has been introduced from East Asia, but since its introduction, it has really devastated the eastern hemlocks, which are native to the entire East Coast. So here I'm showing you on the left a map of the range or the distribution of the eastern hemlock, the tree species, and all of the places that are colored are places where historically this tree species has existed. And what you can see is this red circle and arrow is pointing to the place where we think that the hemlock woolly adelgid was first introduced in 1951, or at least that's when it was first observed in nature. And so from that time and over the last 60 plus years, it has spread to all of the areas that you see in brown. So it hasn't gotten to the entire range of the tree. And just to show you, over here, this picture in the upper right corner, all of these little white specks are the insect, and so the insect is actually really, really small, but they produce this cottony, fuzzy exterior. It's kind of a defense barrier against anything that might try to eat it. So all these white splotches are insects. You can see that they tend to infest these trees at really high densities, and therefore they are really likely to kill their host. So herbivores don't always kill their hosts, but in this case, because they reach such high densities, they do. So you can see that what has happened. So part of the hemlocks range includes the Smoky Mountain National Park, and there's a lot of hemlocks in the park. So what's happened here, as well as a lot of other places, is that large numbers of trees are dying because of being infested by this insect that's invasive. And so we see that this invasive insect is having a negative effect on the abundance of trees within their distribution. But also, if we have populations where all of the trees die, then what we can actually see is a shrinking of the overall range or distribution of this tree because of this herbivore. And so one interesting aside is that there's a lot of interest in managing this insect and trying to get rid of it and at least mitigate the damage that it's doing to these eastern hemlocks. So one thing that's being tried is the introduction of the natural predator of the herbivores. So we have yet another consumer interaction that's being exploited. So this species of beetle is native to East Asia. So its native habitat includes where we find the hemlock woolly adelgid natively, and so so the Park Service has begun releasing these beetles with the hopes that they will target the hemlock woolly adelgid population and keep their numbers in check, so keep them from reaching these explosive levels. And the hope is that they will do this, reduce the abundance of the hemlock woolly adelgids, which will benefit the trees, and that these beetles won't attack any native insects. And so I think right now the jury's still out as to whether this has been really effective, but hopefully in the coming years we'll get to see whether this is making a difference. Okay, so we see herbivores having kind of large-scale effects on the distribution of the species they eat. And then we can also get effects of predators or other consumers at really fine spatial scales or small spatial scales. So for this example, I'm going to talk about the paper that you read last week for discussion. So this is the paper where researchers manipulated the presence or absence of wolf spiders in these little small enclosures in a field. So 2 of the treatments that they used included enclosures where these wolf spiders were present, and then 1 of their treatments had no wolf spiders present at all. And they were interested in the effects of wolf spider presence or absence on other species in the enclosure. And so one thing that they measured was the abundance of these sheet web spiders, which are much smaller and are known to be eaten by wolf spiders in response to these different treatments. And so what they found is that they, of course, you talked about last week, they included within the predator treatment, there were predators that were actually capable of eating prey and those whose mouths had been glued shut, essentially, so they weren't capable of eating prey. So what they found is that wolf spider presence alone reduced the abundance of these other spiders in these small enclosures relative to when the wolf spiders were absent. And so what that tells us is that just the presence of these consumers, not even necessarily the fact that they're consuming their prey, is causing, probably in this case, their prey to leave an area, so to disperse and try to flee from this perceived threat of having a predator around. And so what we see is that if we look at really fine spatial scales, predators, and potentially, well, probably only predators, since plants can't really move to run or hide from their herbivores, can influence the patchiness or the spatial distribution on small spatial scales of their prey. Okay, so large scale, fine scale distribution effects. And then I also want to talk a little bit about parasites. So these are all, here when I'm showing you examples of parasites that humans get. So in the upper right corner we have a picture of a tapeworm. Tapeworms are endoparasites that live in our intestines, or if you are unlucky enough to have a tapeworm, it lives in your intestines and feeds off of the food that you're eating. We have an example of an ectoparasite, so something like a tick that latches on to the exterior of your body and sucks your blood. And then the protus that causes malaria is an example of a parasite. And so all of these things infect humans, so just want to point out that we are part of nature, and we in fact are influenced by these interactions. And most of the time, parasites do not kill their hosts. So unlike predators, which by definition, if they're consuming their prey, they are killing it in the process, that's not always true of parasites. So I think it's interesting to think about why we would expect that behavior in parasites. So here I'm showing you a tapeworm and ticks, which don't kill the hosts necessarily. Malaria we know does, so this is an exception. But in general, parasites are relying on their hosts for food and a place to live. Many parasites have lost the ability to be free living without their hosts, and so if they kill their hosts, they're also killing their habitat and food source. So it's not such a good strategy. And for many, at the very least, parasites often need to complete their life cycle within their host before they can move to a new host, or before they can at least get their babies into a new host. So at the very least, parasites would want to keep their host alive long enough to be able to complete their life cycle and ensure that they're able to disperse or leave that host to get into a new one. So it's not always good to kill your host if you're a parasite. However, that being said, I want to talk about a parasite that does kill its host. So, and this I think is just one of the coolest examples of parasites, and of course the fact that it infects ants makes me interested in it, but hopefully will make you interested as well. So this is the fungi that causes the zombie-like behavior that we see in some ant species. So there is a whole class of fungi that when they infect their insect host, so it's not just ants, they manipulate their host behavior to try to facilitate dispersal or movement into a new host. Okay, so in this example, the host is killed in the process, but it's just so cool. I'm going to show you a short clip of a video by David Attenborough. Oops, sorry about that.
Incredibly, 80% of all insects live in jungles. Few are more successful than the ants. There can be 8 million individuals in a single hectare. But jungle ants don't have it all their own way. These bullet ants are showing some worrying symptoms. Spores from a parasitic fungus called cordyceps have infiltrated their bodies and their minds. Its infected brain directs this ant upwards. Then, utterly disorientated, it grips a stem with its mandibles. Those afflicted that are discovered by the workers are quickly taken away and dumped far away from the colony. It seems extreme, but this is the reason why. Like something out of science fiction, the fruiting body of the cordyceps erupts from the ant's head. It can take 3 weeks to grow, and when finished, the deadly spores will burst from its tip. Then, any ant in the vicinity will be in serious risk of death. The fungus is so virulent, it can wipe out whole colonies of ants. And it's not just ants that fall victim to this killer. There are literally thousands of different types of cordyceps fungi, and remarkably, each specializes on just one species. But these attacks do have a positive effect on the jungle's diversity, since parasites like these stop any one group of animal getting the upper hand. The more numerous a species becomes, the more likely it will be attacked by its nemesis, a cordyceps fungus.
Okay, so I like this video, well, first of all, because it has some really great footage of these fungi and their effects on these insects, but also I like that it comes back at the end to what we talked about when we talked about population growth. So remember, parasites are an example of a density-dependent factor that can maintain or regulate a population near its carrying capacity. So parasites, predators, other things, because the likelihood that they will actually be successful in infecting or attacking their prey or host, that likelihood increases as density in a population increases. They're going to be one of these density dependent factors. Okay, so what we also saw in this video, and I want to remind you, is that parasites are having negative impacts and other consumers on their prey or host fitness. So it's not just having negative effects in kind of a vague way. These interactions are causing a negative impact on prey or host ability to reproduce. And so what we'd expect is that these interactions can have dramatic impacts on the evolution of prey or host species. And so what we see is that instead of prey and host just being kind of helpless victims of their predators, herbivores, or parasites, they have often evolved defense traits in response to selection pressure from consumers. And so we've talked about some examples of this already. You read about a lot in the textbook. So just to name a few, we've talked about escape behavior. So we talked about speed evolving in gazelles to help them, which has allowed them to outrun predators that are trying to attack them. We can talk about camouflage, so the ability to blend in with your environment reduces the likelihood of a predator seeing you and attacking you. And then things that we haven't talked about yet, but that were in the book, are things like chemical defenses. So many plants have, because they do not have the ability to escape from their attackers, have these built-in chemical defenses that can ward off herbivores and other things trying to eat them. So, for example, in chili peppers, the capsaicin, which is the chemical that makes them spicy, which makes us like them and want to eat them, is actually a defense against fungi and some mammals that will eat these peppers without having positive effects of dispersing their seeds, like a bird might, for example. And then we can also think about structural defenses. So, for example, the spines in blackberries are a pretty effective defense against, well, maybe not so much us because we can get around them, but deer or other things that might eat their berries without dispersing their seeds. So another thing you read about in the book is we can classify these defenses as constitutive or induced. And you're going to read a paper this coming week about induced defenses, so I want to do a little bit, talk a little bit about the difference between these types of defenses so you're ready for that paper. So both of these examples I just talked about, capsaicin and chili peppers, spines and blackberries, these are both examples of constitutive defenses. This just means that they're always present. So chili peppers always have capsaicin present, whether or not they're being attacked by an herbivore at any point in time. Blackberries develop spines, whether or not they've been attacked by an herbivore. So they're always present. That's what constitutive means. But we can also have these types of defenses be induced. So that just means that either the presence of the defense or the amount of the defense is increased or produced in response to an herbivore. And so an example of a chemical defense that works this way would be nicotine production in wild tobacco. So nicotine is actually a defensive chemical produced in plants that has a negative impact on the herbivores trying to eat it. So there's some nicotine always present in wild tobacco, but when an herbivore attacks the plant, it will ramp up. It'll increase its production of nicotine to try to deter the herbivore that's trying to eat it and also prevent attack by future herbivores. And then with structural defenses, we can think about the thorns that are on acacia trees, and these live in Africa. So the trees always have thorns, but once they're attacked by herbivores, so things like elephants or giraffes, the thorns will actually get longer. So the thorns are always there, but they're increased in length in response. So that's the induction mechanism. Okay, and you can think about, and maybe I won't talk too much about this in the video, but it's a good idea to think about why this might be a good strategy over always having really long thorns or always having lots and lots of nicotine in your plant tissue. And the paper that you will read in this coming week will get at some of those questions as well. Okay, and so the last thing that I want to talk about is how a parasite has actually influenced the evolution of human populations. And the example I want to talk about is the sickle cell allele that we see at a pretty high frequency in African populations, but not in other human populations. So there's been selection for the sickle cell allele, which is just a mutation that has occurred in a hemoglobin gene. And the selection has been imposed by Plasmodium. So this is the protist that causes malaria. And so the reason that this mutation or this allele has implications for malaria is that the effect of the mutation on the hemoglobin that results from the gene makes the hemoglobin and the red blood cells that they're associated with less susceptible to this protist. So the individuals that have this allele are less susceptible to malaria. And so what's interesting about this is that individuals who have two copies of the sickle cell allele at this particular hemoglobin gene are resistant to malaria, so they're not likely to get malaria, but they also develop a deadly disease called sickle cell anemia. Okay, so many individuals do not live out, their full lifespan when they have sickle cell anemia, when they have two copies of this allele. But the individuals that just have one copy of the sickle cell allele do not get sickle cell anemia, so it's not very severe, and they also don't get malaria because they have resistance. So, as it turns out, in areas where malaria is an actual threat, where it's very abundant, or where the protist is that causes it, individuals that have one copy of this sickle cell allele at this particular hemoglobin gene actually have higher fitness than individuals that just have normal alleles and no sickle cell allele. So what we get is evolution over time that has caused the sickle cell allele to occur at a pretty high frequency in the African population. In human populations where malaria is not much of a threat, we see this allele at very, very low frequencies. Okay, so this is all because of selection pressure imposed by parasites on humans. Okay, and so I'm going to end here. So I've gone through all of these examples of defense traits evolving in prey or host populations because, just to remind you, there's going to be a question on the exam where I'm going to ask you to explain how natural selection could have caused some particular trait. So I will give you a trait on the exam to evolve within a population. So when you're answering this question, I want you to be able to mention all three requirements that must be met for natural selection to occur, and then also include a statement that describes the evolutionary change. And so what I'm expecting with that statement is just something that lets me know that you know that evolution is something that's happening at the population level and that's happening over several generations, at least from one generation to the next, if not more time. Okay, so I want you to go ahead and start practicing doing that so that you're ready for the exam. And that's the end.